There's something I want to express in a way I almost never do, because this topic deserves nothing less than full honesty. If I water down the words, it would take away from the truth I'm trying to share. What we're about to look into isn't the familiar kind of justice where someone who caused pain eventually faces a perfectly measured consequence that makes everything feel fair again. Real life rarely works that way. What actually unfolds is far messier and, in many ways, far more believable. This is about the inner psychological journey of an avoidant after they deeply wound someone whose love quietly became one of the most meaningful parts of their existence, even if they never said it out loud. Even when their behavior signaled distance rather than closeness, that person often held a far bigger place in their emotional world than they ever consciously realized. When I say the word betrayal, I'm not only referring to the obvious acts everyone instantly recognizes, I'm also talking about the quieter kinds of betrayal that leave invisible wounds. It's pulling back when someone desperately needed closeness. It's staying silent when reassurance was needed most. It's building a pattern of warmth followed by distance that gives someone hope only to slowly strip it away again. It's receiving deep, wholehearted love without giving the same emotional effort back. These moments are betrayals, even if the avoidant never meant them to be. Often they don't even realize what they've done, and that lack of awareness is one of the most important pieces of this entire conversation. The person on the receiving end feels those moments intensely, not just emotionally, but physically and mentally too. Those experiences leave lasting marks, while inside the avoidant, a much slower and far less visible process quietly starts to take shape. Before we can understand what eventually happens inside an avoidant, we first need to understand why they were so unaware to begin with. Their blindness wasn't a minor detail in this story. It was the actual reason everything played out the way it did. They didn't realize that hurting you would eventually bring consequences they could never have predicted, because they never truly grasped what your presence meant to them. This wasn't because they consciously decided you didn't matter or purposely dismissed your worth. It came instead from how avoidant attachment reshapes perception. It causes them to underestimate the value of a meaningful connection while they still have it, and at the same time, it convinces them that losing it won't hit as hard as it truly will. This is one of the most painful contradictions of avoidant psychology. The same emotional defenses that shield them from the fear of loss also stop them from fully appreciating what they have before it slips away. The walls that keep painful emotions out also block a deeper awareness of love, security, and emotional meaning from ever fully getting in. Because of this, an avoidant can go through something genuinely rare and meaningful without realizing how extraordinary it was until much later. Due to this distorted way of seeing things, the avoidant makes choices without fully grasping what's truly on the line. Every withdrawal, every stretch of emotional distance, every failure to show up consistently, and every betrayal, whether obvious or subtle, happens while they're missing crucial emotional information. They believe they're stepping away from something they can always come back to whenever they choose. They assume the relationship can withstand repeated neglect, emotional inconsistency, or long stretches of distance without being permanently altered. They tell themselves the connection will always be there whenever they feel ready to return to it. What they don't see is that some relationships can't be endlessly tested without paying a price. Some kinds of love are truly irreplaceable, and once broken beyond repair, no amount of later understanding can bring them back to what they once were. Their own attachment system actively hides this truth from them, making the emotional cost nearly impossible to see while they still have the chance to protect what matters most. By the time that understanding finally starts to surface, the chance to make different choices has usually already slipped away. What makes this whole process even more meaningful is that the real consequences almost never show up right away. They surface much later, once enough time has passed for the avoidant's protective walls to slowly wear down. That delay changes everything because it lets the emotional weight build quietly beneath the surface without ever being fully acknowledged. Right after the relationship ends, after distance has settled in, or after the damage is already done, the avoidance defense mechanisms kick into overdrive. Their mind immediately starts doing what it has always been trained to do. It minimizes painful feelings, rearranges uncomfortable memories, and builds explanations that make everything feel easier to carry. These unconscious strategies protect the avoidant from being emotionally overwhelmed and help preserve the identity they've built around staying emotionally self-sufficient. From the outside, this stretch of time often looks like total indifference. It seems as though they've moved on with ease, completely unaffected by what happened. For the person left behind, this can be one of the most gutting experiences imaginable because it feeds the painful belief that the relationship never truly mattered to the avoidant at all. And yet, this is one of the biggest misconceptions in avoidant relationship dynamics. What looks like emotional freedom is often just a temporary psychological shield, not an honest reflection of what's actually happening underneath. What seems like emotional detachment is rarely genuine indifference. More often, it's an emotional defense working at full strength. The avoidant is unconsciously pulling on every psychological tool available to keep themselves from feeling the full weight of what happened and what was lost. Their calm exterior isn't proof the relationship meant little. It's evidence that they're holding themselves together by keeping painful emotions buried beneath the surface. At this stage, they can't afford to fully feel the consequences, because doing so would shake the very coping mechanisms keeping them functional. But those defenses don't last forever. Eventually, reality grows stronger than suppression. The turning point almost always comes when they're faced with undeniable proof that the person they once assumed would always be within reach has genuinely built a life without them. It's no longer the temporary distance they thought they could undo whenever they felt ready. Instead, they're confronted with a permanent absence that quietly signals the chapter has truly closed. Sometimes that realization comes simply from noticing that you're no longer emotionally available, not because you're trying to make a point or stir jealousy, but because you have genuinely moved forward. The emotional energy that once revolved around them has been redirected into your own healing, growth, and peace. You're no longer waiting for them to change or come back. Your life has found its own rhythm, and your happiness no longer depends on their choices. Other times, the realization comes from seeing a completely different version of you, whether through a chance meeting, a mutual friend, or even something as small as a photo. They see someone who looks calmer, stronger, more confident, and more at ease within themselves. The quiet self-respect that slowly grew after the relationship ended now becomes impossible to overlook. Unlike before, this version of you cuts through all the emotional filters that once protected them. It forces them to face a reality they can no longer reframe or shrink down. In that moment, the psychological reckoning truly begins, and it runs far deeper than most people would ever guess. What comes next isn't dramatic in the way movies often portray regret. It's much quieter, but also far more powerful. The first stage unfolds inside their own mind. They start seeing the relationship with a clarity that simply wasn't available to them while they were living through it. For the first time, they recognize the true worth of what they had and the part their own actions played in losing it. This isn't ordinary nostalgia or a rose-tinted memory. It's a sharp shift in perception that arrives only after months or even years of emotional suppression. Because those realizations were held back for so long, they hit with enormous force once the psychological walls begin to crack. The diminished version of you that they had quietly carried in their mind gets replaced by the real person you always were. They start recalling your emotional depth, your steadiness, your compassion, and the rare way you understood parts of them they barely understood themselves. They finally see that your patience was never weakness, but an extraordinary act of strength and commitment that few people would have ever given them. As that clearer picture forms, another layer becomes even harder to avoid. They're no longer simply recognizing your value, they're forced to face their own responsibility. This is nothing like casually admitting they made a few mistakes. It becomes an emotional awareness that cuts far deeper than logic. Given enough time and enough undeniable proof, they start seeing every moment with painful precision. They remember every chance they had to stay emotionally present and how they chose distance instead. They replay the conversations where reassurance was needed and how silence became their answer. They notice the pattern they created without fully realizing it back then, pulling closer whenever they feared losing you, then retreating the moment real intimacy came within reach. They see how they offered just enough affection to keep hope flickering while withholding the emotional honesty that real partnership demanded. What once felt justified now looks like a pattern that slowly wore down the very connection they secretly relied on, leaving them to face the hard truth that many of their biggest losses were caused by the very defenses they thought were protecting them. Eventually, they begin to see every moment with a clarity that was once out of reach. They recognize how often you met their distance with kindness, how many times you chose understanding over resentment, and how patiently you carried the emotional weight of the relationship without getting the same effort back. They realize your compassion was never something they earned, and yet you gave it freely regardless. They also see that they failed to appreciate it while they still had the chance. That awareness brings a deep sense of shame, one that goes far beyond simple regret. It isn't only about realizing they made mistakes. It's about facing the fact that someone loved them with real sincerity, and they responded with fear instead of courage. For many avoidants, this becomes one of the most painful realizations of their life, because it forces them to confront a version of themselves they had spent years avoiding. When I say this betrayal can wreck an avoidant's life, I don't mean everything around them suddenly falls apart. Their career may go on as usual, their routines may stay intact, and from the outside they might look perfectly successful. The real cost is much quieter than that, but often far more lasting. What they lose isn't just the relationship. They lose access to a version of themselves that only ever existed because of the connection they shared with you, Around your presence, parts of them were slowly becoming more open, more emotionally alive, more genuine. Your patience, your encouragement, and your steady love gently drew out qualities their defenses had kept buried for years. That growth was never something they built on their own. It depended entirely on the unique emotional space the relationship gave them. Through repeated withdrawal, avoidance, and emotional betrayal, they slowly dismantled the very environment that let those healthier parts of themselves come alive. What's left afterward isn't really the life they had before you. It's often a smaller version of it. Before the relationship, they couldn't miss something they had never known. After losing it, they carry the knowledge of what was possible, and that knowledge changes everything. The independence they once took pride in no longer feels fully satisfying. In quieter moments, it can start to feel less like freedom and more like emotional confinement. The self-sufficient identity they worked so hard to protect now carries the weight of knowing that real closeness once existed and that they couldn't hold on to it. They remember what it felt like to be truly understood, accepted, and emotionally supported, and ordinary connections may never quite reach that same depth again. This doesn't necessarily consume them every day, but it quietly settles into their emotional world. It shows up in unexpected moments, in relationships that never feel entirely whole, in evenings that feel strangely hollow, and in private thoughts they push aside quickly because they're too uncomfortable to sit with. There's another consequence worth just as much attention. The betrayal reshapes not only what they lost, but who they slowly become. Our lives take shape through the choices we repeat during our most defining moments. People are absolutely capable of real growth and genuine change, but our repeated decisions also reinforce certain psychological patterns. Every time an avoidant picks emotional protection over vulnerability, that defense becomes a little easier to lean on next time. Every moment they retreat instead of staying present strengthens the habit of pulling away. Every relationship where fear wins over openness makes real connection feel a little more foreign. Over time, the gap between who they truly are and the guarded identity they show the world quietly widens. The betrayal doesn't just end one relationship. It reinforces the very defenses that caused the loss in the first place, making future intimacy harder to reach unless they consciously choose to break those deeply worn patterns. Because of all this, the life they go on living can look completely stable from the outside. They may function well, do fine in their career, keep up friendships, and appear emotionally put together. Avoidants are often very capable of building lives that look organized and successful, but beneath that surface sits a private awareness that's hard to shake. They know something deeply meaningful was offered to them, and that they weren't able to fully receive it. They know a real chance existed for emotional growth, deeper intimacy, and a more honest version of themselves, but they turned away from it because fear felt safer than vulnerability. That understanding doesn't always sit at the front of their mind, but it quietly shapes how they experience future relationships and how they see themselves, surfacing whenever honest self-reflection breaks through the walls they've spent years maintaining. As we reach the end of this, I want to encourage you to focus on something more valuable than the idea of justice. It's completely understandable if part of you feels a sense of relief knowing your pain wasn't meaningless, and that the person who hurt you isn't simply walking away without consequence. That feeling can bring real comfort, and there's nothing wrong with sitting with it. But if you stop there, your focus stays fixed on them instead of on your own healing. The most important part of this story was never what was happening inside the avoidant. It has always been what's been happening inside you the whole time. While they leaned on emotional defenses, you have been facing your pain head-on, honestly and directly. You allowed yourself to grieve, to reflect, to grow, and to slowly rebuild without hiding behind emotional distance. That process made your character stronger instead of weaker. Your ability to love with honesty, accountability, and emotional courage hasn't disappeared because of what happened. It has grown even stronger through everything you went through. The avoidant never understood what they were risking because the wounds driving their behavior kept them from seeing the true value of the connection while it still existed. By the time that understanding finally landed, the chance to protect it had already slipped away. They were making life-altering decisions without truly grasping what those decisions meant. They acted from a place where fear clouded their judgment, treating something deeply valuable as if it could always be recovered later. What deserved honesty, awareness, and emotional courage was instead handled with confusion, distance, and self-protection. The consequences of those choices didn't vanish when the relationship ended. They became part of the avoidant's inner world, quietly shaping how they see themselves long after the temporary comfort of withdrawal wore off. The relief that came from building walls was always short-lived, but the cost of keeping those walls up became permanent. That truth matters because it reminds you that your experience was real. What happened between you actually mattered, and the emotional fallout wasn't only felt on your side of things. You deserve to know that the impact reached far beyond the moment everything fell apart. But even more important than what happened inside them is what happened inside you. While they were shielding themselves from difficult emotions, you were doing the much harder work of facing yours head-on. Through heartbreak, uncertainty, disappointment, and grief, you slowly built something no one could have simply handed you. You developed a sense of self-respect that no longer depends on someone else's approval. You found inner confidence rooted in your own character, not in whether someone else recognizes your worth. You came to understand that your ability to love deeply isn't a weakness, but one of your greatest strengths, and that you deserve a relationship where that love comes back to you with the same consistency, honesty, and commitment. None of that growth was an accident. It wasn't just some unexpected side effect of your pain. It became the most meaningful part of your journey, turning an experience that only wounded you into one that also revealed your own strength. The avoidant walked into the relationship without fully appreciating what they had, and because of that blindness, they made choices that slowly wore down something truly rare. In losing you, they also lost the chance to keep becoming the version of themselves your love had quietly nurtured. Your presence gave them a space where they could have grown past old defenses and found a more genuine way of living, but they couldn't see that opportunity until it was already gone. You, though, walked away with a very different outcome. Even after enduring the confusion, the emotional distance, the silence, and the exhausting work of healing, you didn't lose the most important part of yourself. Instead, you found it. You gained a deeper understanding of your own worth, clearer boundaries, sharper emotional wisdom, and a stronger connection to who you really are. That growth didn't erase the pain, but it gave the pain a purpose that reached far beyond the relationship itself. That's why this story, in the end, isn't really about the avoidant's regret. It's about your transformation. Their greatest loss was the connection they failed to value until it was gone. Your greatest gain was discovering that your identity was never dependent on someone else choosing you. The confidence you've built, the emotional clarity you've earned, and the understanding that you deserve to be loved with the same openness and devotion you freely offer others are now permanent parts of who you are. No one can take that from you. It can't be undone by another person's fear, distance, or inability to receive love. It belongs entirely to you because you built it through your own courage and resilience. In the end, that's the only lasting victory that truly counts. Relationships can start and end, people can leave, and opportunities can slip away, but the person you became through the experience stays with you forever. That's the one thing no betrayal can ever take away, and it's the only outcome truly worth fighting for. If there's one final thought I want to leave you with, it's this. Don't fall into the trap of believing your story ends the moment the avoidant realizes what they lost. That realization, if it ever comes, belongs to their journey, not yours. It's a chapter in their psychological experience, but it was never meant to be the destination of your healing. Too many people unknowingly put their emotional freedom on hold while waiting for someone else to finally understand the value of what they walked away from. They tell themselves they'll finally feel at peace once the avoidant regrets their choices, once they apologize, once they come back, or once life eventually teaches them the lesson they refused to learn during the relationship. But if your healing depends on their awakening, then your peace is still living inside their decisions. That means your emotional future stays tied to someone who has already shown you they couldn't carry that responsibility. Real healing asks for something completely different. It asks you to take your life back before they ever understand what they lost. It asks you to stop tying your future to their level of awareness, because whether they eventually see the truth or never face it at all, your chance to build a meaningful, peaceful, deeply fulfilling life exists right now. The moment you stop measuring your progress by what's happening inside them is the moment your own transformation speeds up in ways you never imagined possible.